Finally, we're going to talk about maintaining IT security systems. So we have to constantly monitor and improve IT security. We can't get complacent with what we have. We can't implement technology and then get complacent that it's working and assume everything's going to work into perpetuity. Of course, we're going to have issues over time. We want to make sure that we're ahead of those issues and that we're ahead of changes in technology and we're ahead of any changes in vulnerabilities and threats and things like that. So change, of course, is good, which we just talked about in the previous slide deck. And now we're going to talk about reasons that we need to monitor what we have and make sure we're constantly shifting our needs to improve our infrastructure. So there are security management maintenance models that can be adopted to manage change in the operation of ongoing security program. Models are frameworks that structure the tasks of managing a particular set of activities or business functions. So they're designed to focus organizational effort on maintaining systems. So there are 5 subject areas for maintenance that are discussed in your book. There's external monitoring, internal monitoring, planning and risk assessment, vulnerability assessment and remediation, readiness and review. So these are the 5 subject areas that we're going to talk about. So again, we have our internal monitoring, our external monitoring, planning and risk assessment, readiness review, and vulnerability assessment and remediation. So we're going to talk about all of these different elements. Let's start with monitoring the external environment. So the objective here is to provide early awareness of new and emerging threats. So what we're trying to do with monitoring the external environment is make sure we're aware of things that are happening outside our network and our infrastructure, what's happening in the larger world, to make sure that we're prepared for that. So we can acquire threat and vulnerability data that is not difficult. We can turn data into information for decision makers can use. And external intelligence comes from vendors, computer emergency response teams, public network sources, or membership sites. So again, our external environment, we're looking at emerging threats. We're looking at new types of threats, new technologies that we have to support, and so forth and so on. All right, so continuing with this, monitoring, escalation, incident response. So functional of external monitoring process to monitor activity, report results, and escalate warnings. Monitoring process has 3 primary deliverables: specific warning bulletins that are issued, periodic summaries of external information, and detailed intelligence for highest risk warnings. In other words, we're looking at what's happening that could be a risk to us. So for example, through external monitoring in this way, we might know that there is a new virus that is possible, or we're aware of some new ransomware threat that we have to protect against, by keeping up with what's going on. Over time, external monitoring processes should capture information about external environment in appropriate formats, et cetera, et cetera. Again, that's all just stuff from your book. So, monitoring the internal environments. Now we're going to switch gears to, I'll go back here. So now let's switch gears to monitoring the internal environment. So this is what's happening inside our environment. So we might be inventorying network devices and channels, IT infrastructure, applications, information security elements like firewalls, routers, and so forth and so on. Again, this is in conjunction with IT governance, which we talked about before, real-time monitoring of IT activity, monitoring the internal state of organizations' network and systems. So we should have some kind of inventory. We know what we have. We know what its vulnerabilities are. So we're doing some internal monitoring for that. Another part of internal monitoring is intrusion detection systems and prevention systems, which we talked about previously. So we talked about these types of systems. And of course, making sure that they work and that they're functional and getting meaningful use from this infrastructure is important. So again, that's all part of internal monitoring. We also are going to be trying to detecting any differences between what we know we should have and what's actually happening. So for example, if we know that the policy states that we should have certain ports open in the firewall, and we detect that that's changed, either through some kind of periodic vulnerability scanning, which we'll talk about later, or something along those lines, we're going to try to detect those differences. Maybe people are running versions of operating systems or browsers that are not supported and things like that. We're trying to detect those differences, and there's software and processes that can help you do that. So the next objective is planning and risk assessment. The primary objective is to keep a lookout over the entire information security program by identifying and planning ongoing information security activities that further reduce risks. So establishing a formal information security program review process, instituting formal project identification, selection, planning, and management processes, and coordinating with IT project teams to introduce risk assessment and review for all IT projects. So, in other words, we're constantly making sure that we're assessing risk for all of our projects, anything new that's being added that's outside the scope of IT security. We're making sure that it complies and that we understand the risk of those projects. We might do periodic reviews of ongoing enhancements and extensions, examining future IT needs and how that affects risks and so forth and so on. So again, that's going to be our risk assessment. So large projects should be broken into smaller projects. Again, and this is for risk, to minimize risk. We can do security risk assessments. Your book says this is a key component for driving security program change is risk assessment. But we talked about risk assessment before. So we make sure we're doing ongoing risk assessment to understand how risk is going to affect our organization. So vulnerability assessment and remediation. So the primary goal here is identification of specific documented vulnerabilities and timely remediation of those vulnerabilities. So we might do vulnerability scanning and things like that. I'll talk about that just very briefly. Tracking vulnerabilities from the time that they are identified, communicating vulnerability information to owners of vulnerable systems to make sure they understand the vulnerabilities, and reporting the status of vulnerabilities over time. So, vulnerability assessment. So the process of identifying and documenting specific or provable flaws in an organization's information asset. That is vulnerability assessment. So there's a couple different techniques to doing this. One of the ways of doing vulnerability assessment is penetration testing. This is one of those topics where I always say you could take a whole class on this. And there are classes you can take that solely are all about penetration testing and how to do this type of vulnerability testing. So there's a set of tests that you do to evaluate and simulate attacks that would happen from an external source. So you kind of simulate what would happen if an attacker was to attack your network. And this is usually, sometimes people shorten this to pen test. You'll hear people talk about pen testing. Usually it's part of a security audit, so it's definitely something that we should periodically do. There are two ways to really approach these types of penetration tests. There's the black box approach and the white box approach. The black box approach is very realistic. That's where whoever's doing the penetration testing knows nothing about our internal networks. They have to do all that on their own, just like a real attacker would, unless, of course, it's an inside attacker, which is another concern. But a black box attack, they're approaching it and they're trying to figure out how to attack the network without knowing anything about our organization. A white box attack, on the other hand, is where the attacker does know about our internal infrastructure. So usually if you have internal employees doing a penetration test, that is by default the white box test because they already know the infrastructure. They already know what the vulnerabilities are. They're just trying to see if they can find them as if they're an attacker. But a black box test, we don't tell the tester anything about the internal network and we rely on them to try to figure it out. And that gives us a good idea in the real world of how effective these controls are. A black box test is definitely good for real world scenarios, but a white box test kind of takes it a step further because now that we know the vulnerabilities, we're seeing if somebody were to stumble across those vulnerabilities, if they would be able to take advantage of those. So an internet vulnerability assessment is designed to find and document vulnerability present in your public network. So this might involve looking at anything that's public facing, anything in your DMZ, portals, databases, things like that might be used by customers, APIs that we have available to customers and outside the organization, our public facing website. So all of those types of things to see. And remember, I've talked about that before, how what's in our DMZ is sort of like the lobby of our network. It's everybody can get into the lobby. We just want to make sure they can't get any further. But we also want to make sure that if they are in the lobby, they can't steal the paintings. So that's what we're looking at with some of this vulnerability assessment. So intranet vulnerability assessment is looking at the internal network, or looking at it from the inside to see what can be done or what kind of vulnerabilities might exist on the internal network. So attackers are often internal members of the organization. So the vast majority of attacks that are successful are done by insiders, people that are inside the network. Or it could be automated attack vectors, for example, viruses and worms that are already installed in our network. Once they get into our network, then it's as if they're there. It's as if they're inside the network. So we have to be aware of that. The assessment is usually performed against critical internal resources or devices with a known high value by using a selective penetration testing. So we're going to test our database servers. We're going to test, all the things that contain a lot of, maybe our Active Directory, DNS, things that are of high value or might have the most adverse effects on the organization if they're attacked. Platform security validation is when we look at specific systems and platforms. So in this example, maybe we're looking at the Oracle database and we're determining whether the version of Oracle we're using is appropriate, is secure, does it have any vulnerabilities that we're aware of. We might look at specific operating systems, what patch level software is on and things like that to try to look for vulnerabilities at the system level or at the platform level. There's the wireless vulnerability assessment, where we're trying to assess the vulnerability of our networks, of our wireless networks, that is, which of course is important. We've talked about this before about how wireless networks are, a special case because you don't need physical access. You don't have to be in the building. It can come from outside the building, and there's plenty of examples of attacks like that. And we talk about some of those in IT security too, as well, specifically how people carry out those attacks. A modem vulnerability assessment is looking for any vulnerabilities present in dial-up modems. Good Lord, who still uses those? But believe it or not, there are still a lot of areas where we use dial-up modems still, maybe for specific support for certain devices. There are certainly older technologies that rely on dial-up and so forth and so on, but we make sure that we don't have a vulnerability with those systems. And one thing to remember is sometimes you have old servers laying around that still have dial-up modems on them that are still connected that no one's even used in years. And when we war dial ourselves, we find those vulnerabilities. There's no shortage of stories where IT security managers have found that there's been a modem sitting on a server in a data center somewhere, wide open, just waiting for somebody to dial in. Maybe it hasn't been used in years, but once somebody discovers it, they can access the network through that. And there are other little things like that, maybe that we're not aware of, that we discover through vulnerability assessments. And of course, we want to document all of these vulnerabilities. So a good strategy is to have a database for these vulnerabilities so we can track them. When we find them, they don't magically go away because we know about them. We have to make sure that we can follow up and make sure that they are resolved over time. So that's certainly one way of handling these vulnerabilities. So remediation of vulnerabilities, the objective is to repair the flaw or fix the flaw. If we can't fix it, our last resort is to make sure that whoever has the proper authority can accept the risk. We can say, okay, we don't have a way to fix this vulnerability, so let's just accept the risk. I'll give you an example. Let's say you've got a database server that has a known vulnerability. Maybe it's not on the latest patch version, or maybe it's an older version of that software, and you know that it's vulnerable to some kind of an attack. So you've got a couple options there. One is you can remediate by putting it behind a firewall, by isolating it, and so forth and so on. But maybe those aren't options because of the way the software is used. So you go and talk to the department that's using this particular platform and you say, look, you've got this vulnerability, we need to fix it. And they tell you, well, our vendor says that we can't upgrade to that version because it's not supported in our client application or something along those lines. Or, maybe we just don't support that particular enhancement. And at that point, you would say, okay, well, that's, that violates our policy. So I have to get somebody with authority that can accept that risk and tell us it's okay to leave that on the network. So that would be an example of that. We can accept the risk, which I just talked about, and we can transfer risk. I talked about the classic, which is buying insurance, is the classic way to transfer risk to another entity. So if there is a problem, they're on the hook for whatever happens when somebody is able to access a server with a bunch of customer records or something like that. You can certainly get insurance. A lot of us do that with identity theft, right? So a lot of folks transfer their risk for identity theft. It's easier to pay for identity theft protection than it is to take the proper steps to make sure your identity doesn't get stolen in the first place. The only way you can really make sure that people can't steal your credit card number is to never use your credit card. So having some kind of insurance or transferring that risk to someone else is certainly one strategy. And we all do that with our credit cards. Most of our credit cards have some kind of transference where the bank takes responsibility if somebody steals our credit card number and we get that money back. We can remove the threat. So in some circumstances, they can be removed without repairing the vulnerability. Other vulnerabilities may be mitigated by inexpensive controls like air gapping if it's possible, using isolation on the network, and so forth and so on. And of course, we can repair the vulnerability. We can apply a patch. We can apply a workaround. We can do something to minimize that vulnerability or to completely dissolve that vulnerability. Readiness and review. So the goal here is to keep the information security program functioning as designed and continuously improving through policy review, program review, and rehearsals. So another area is digital forensics. So digital forensics is used to document what's happened during an attack on assets and how that attack occurred. It's based on the field of traditional forensics. I've taught forensics classes in the past, and it's funny because people sometimes take these digital forensics classes thinking they're going to learn about all the stuff they see on CSI, where they have these fancy computers scanning fingerprints and things like that. In fact, one of the colleges I've taught at in the past, the digital forensics class was required for students who were paralegal majors, even though it had nothing to do with IT security. And I always have to tell the paralegal people that this is not an appropriate class because we're learning about how to use the concepts of forensic science to assess what's happened and to understand what's happened and use those techniques. So again, it's certainly one of the things we have in our tool set. So we use it for two purposes: to investigate allegations of digital malfeasance within an organization, and for performing root cause analysis to figure out what happened, how it happened, and how we can prevent that in the future. One of the ways I like to explain digital forensics, there's this television show that I always like to watch. One of the safest ways to travel is by airplane. Airplanes do occasionally crash, but airplane crashes have been becoming increasingly rare. And the reason that airplane crashes are becoming increasingly rare is because when a crash occurs, we have the National Transportation Safety Board, whose job is to figure out exactly how it happened, to alert the airlines and whoever in the FAA how it happened and how to prevent that in the future. So every time it happens, we learn why it happens. As a society, we learn and understand how it happens, and we take steps to keep it from happening in the future. And every time that happens, every time they do those investigations, it gets a little bit safer and a little bit better. And we can do the same thing in IT. Anytime something happens, we can learn how it happened. We can get to the root cause. And far too often, it's too easy to just move on and forget about what the root cause was until it happens again. And things happen repetitively, and we never really know what's causing it. But when you watch this television show, there's a TV show called Air Disasters on the Smithsonian Channel. And when you watch that TV show, they get into such detail. It's not enough for them to know that the plane crashed because at first they know the plane crashed because maybe there was a failure in the control surface somewhere. All they know is the pilot lost control of the plane and it crashed. But they don't stop there. And they say, what did they lose control over? Oh, they lost control of the rudder. Why did they lose control over the rudder? There was a failure in the hydraulics. Why was there a failure in the hydraulics? Because of this one little screw that was put in the wrong way. Okay, now we know the root cause. You get to the very smallest common denominator of what caused that issue. And that's root cause analysis. And it's very important in IT security to do that so we understand exactly what happened and how to prevent that in the future. There are two approaches. There's the protect and forget, or patch and proceed, which is where we know what happened, we figured it out, we fixed the problem, and we move on. We don't, go after anybody. We just say, that's it, we're done, we got it fixed, let's move on. We don't even care. Apprehend and prosecute, or pursue and prosecute, is where we try to identify the responsible individuals and hold them accountable. Now, the problem is that that's expensive. And the other problem is it involves law enforcement, it involves the authorities, and a lot of companies don't have an appetite for that. And the other problem is, when these things are coming from offshore, from Russia or from the Ukraine or from China, there's really not much we could do, even if we do involve the authorities. So it doesn't always pay to waste our time and effort to do that. So most organizations seem to go with the patch and proceed method. So most organizations cannot sustain a permanent digital forensics team. So they can collect data and outsource it for analysis, but they can't have a digital forensics team on staff. The vast majority of organizations. But again, you can outsource that stuff to other organizations. So if you have something that happened, you're not sure how it happened, you can bring in a consulting firm that can help you figure that out, especially when it's a major vulnerability or a major problem or a big, let's say your Target and a bunch of credit card numbers got stolen. You don't know how it happened. You just know it happens because, somewhere on Pastebin on the internet is all of your customers' credit card information. So you could bring in a digital forensics consulting team to come in and help you figure out exactly how it happened and go through. And if they can figure it out, try to assess what could have happened and what you can do to protect yourself in the future. Sometimes that happens as well. If we don't have the logging and we don't have auditing and things available to us, sometimes we can't do root cause analysis. So those things are certainly important. When it comes to digital forensics, some of the vernacular is important to be familiar with. Affidavit is one, which is a sworn testimony that certain facts are in the possession of the investigating officer and can be used to request a search warrant. So affidavits are the facts, items, and place which are specified. So when approving authority signs an affidavit, it becomes a search warrant giving permission to search at a specific location for a specific thing. And again, if you take a forensics class, this is one of those topics. You could take an entire class about this, but you will learn in much more detail exactly how all this works from a legal perspective. And as I said, a lot of times companies aren't so concerned about the legal aspects of digital forensics, more the root cause analysis portion of digital forensics. But digital forensics, even when we're not concerned with the legal aspects, can quickly turn to legal, especially when it's an inside job. If we discover that a certain employee was responsible for stealing the credit card numbers, then it becomes important for us to prosecute and get the authorities involved. And that could quickly become a criminal case or a civil case, depending on the scenario and the circumstances. So sometimes those things can become a legal case. And also, in many cases, IT security gets involved with human resources when an employee is suspected of using IT resources inappropriately. So maybe they're violating some policies, or maybe they're violating acceptable use policies. Maybe they're running a business on the side from their work computer during work hours, and they're going to ask you to prove that. And if you do prove that, it may be necessary for that to be proven in court if the employee, disagrees with the assessment and decides to sue the company. And, now you got to go sit in court and explain how you came to that conclusion. So again, it's important to be aware of the legalities of digital forensics for those reasons. All right. So when you're doing digital forensics, you're going to acquire or seize evidence without altering or damaging it. Which again, if you take a digital forensics class, they talk extensively about how to do that. There are certainly tools available to do that. There are methods and techniques that you can use using certain tools that are both software and hardware to make sure that we're not altering or damaging the evidence that we're collecting. Take steps to assure the evidence is at every step verifiably authentic and unchanged. So that's called the chain of custody or of evidence, and that's of course a very important part of digital forensics, especially when things turn legal. Analyze the data without risking modification. Again, there are tools and techniques to do that, and reporting the findings to the proper authority, whether it's internal or an external authority. Okay, so that's everything you need to know about maintaining information systems. And that actually concludes all of the slide decks for this course. Thank you for watching.